Tristan Kumar's Dying Planet, The Season of Chaos. Narrated by Tristan Kumar. Part 25. Termination. I woke up in my bed. I looked around. The blinds were closed. I looked at the clock on my nightside table. 7:09 a.m. I got out of my bed and opened the blinds. It was still the same old view. I looked over the city of Los Angeles. In many spots were different vehicles from different universes. There were so many webs stretching across the sky like a highway to the multiverse. I opened my door and headed into the hallway. The hallways were lined with tan color and real gold from a universe where gold was a natural resource instead of wood. I went to an elevator and started to go down to the base floor. Once I arrived, I walked past many weirdly dressed people registering their stay in this universe. I headed outside and walked across the busy street. Many uniquely dressed people walked on the sidewalk as I walked by them. I came to a coffee shop and walked in. Some people were sitting down and talking to people from other universes, but luckily, there was no one in line. I ordered my regular coffee and went back to the building where I came from. I looked over the entrance as I walked in and saw the gold-lined letters spelling multi-labs. I headed inside and to the elevator. As I walked to the elevator, a bunch of people tried to ask me questions. I just ignored them. I headed back up to my room and went to my window. I bent down and set my coffee on the ground and dragged the chair near the open window. I sat down on it and drank my coffee. I inspected my cup, wondering what day it was. At the bottom of the cup, it read 10/28/2036. Time had seemed to pass by so quickly. I thought to myself about what had happened in the past few years while I drank my coffee. Once we created multiverse technology, we officially created multi-labs and presented it to many businesses. We decided to split the profit by 20%, splitting it equally between Aaron, Chris, Xander, Jamal, and me. We made so much money in those times, the golden years. We were still selling multiverse technology everywhere across the cosmos by the year 2036. Life was good, really good. Our annual revenue was around $582 billion. I finished my coffee and threw it away. I headed back outside and down the elevator, this time descending deeper than the lobby into the lab. When the doors opened, I saw many different people working together on projects. Sparks flew everywhere as I walked past them. I looked around. Beside me, a bunch of workers worked on a large scorpion robot hanging on a rack. I had a faint memory of a time when I had seen something like that, but couldn't remember it. On a work table, I saw a metal arm being constructed. I looked at many other inventions, but eventually reached a door at the end of the workspace. I opened it and walked in on Chris, Rogers, Aaron, and Xander. "I think we should cut her out," Aaron finished whispering as I walked in. They immediately changed the topic the moment I walked in. Everyone was getting older now. Jamal was taller, Chris and Xander were sporting some white strands of hair, while Aaron had grown out his beard but kept his hair short. I walked away from the door and sat down in my chair. "So, what's up?" I asked. "Nothing. We were just talking about, business," Aaron said. The rest of the men nodded and looked around. I heard the sound of paper sliding down a metal tube, and I looked at the mail chute. A package of papers with some rubber bands around them stopped at the bottom. I stood up and went to grab some mail from the mail chute. I read the titles of all of the papers. It was just more invitations to famous people's dinner parties or invitations for us to give a speech on some dumb topics. I threw it to the table with a small black ball, which was barely noticeable. The men gathered around it and started looking through the mail. I walked to a wall and placed my hand against it. A tile went into the wall and moved to the side. Inside, there were the other 2 syringes of the red liquid from 3 years ago. I could barely even remember what happened back then. I walked to the door and went outside. I pulled out an earpiece and put them in my ears. All of the noise outside suddenly went away. The black ball that I threw with the mail was a device where I could hear what they were saying even through walls. "So, what do we think?" Xander said through the device. "I think that you're right," Aaron said. "We should just take the liquid and then ditch her," Chris said. "We could even split the profits 25% each then," Jamal said excitingly. I scowled at them. Betraying me after all these years that we've been together, I thought to myself. "All right," Xander said. "The next time she unlocks that door, we hold it open, grab the stuff, and drop her." I heard what seemed to be all the men nodding in agreement. I took the device out of my ear and stuffed it into my pocket. I opened the door, and the men suddenly started talking about other stuff. I didn't even look at them as I sat down. They all suddenly stood up. "Oh, I need to go somewhere," Jamal said. The other guys agreed as they left the table and walked out. Once they left, I rolled my eyes and sighed at all their dumb excuses. I walked to the wall where the syringes were hidden. I placed my hand on the wall. I took the syringe out, and before the compartment shut and locked, I quickly grabbed a crowbar from the supply closet next to the compartment. I shoved the crowbar into the gap and ripped open the door. I threw the door onto the table in anger. After all this time, they were just using me. It slid across the papers and eventually stopped in the middle of the table. I grabbed the crowbar with both hands and raised it over my head. I slammed it down on the table and it started to shatter. I continued to smash the table until I eventually lodged the crowbar into the table. That's what you get for ditching me, I thought. I opened the door and walked through the construction. I made it to the elevator and headed outside. I went to under a bridge and looked around. The sound from the cars all around surrounded me. I looked at the buildings and some guards walked out. They looked at me and pointed at me. They started to run towards me. The boys had probably ratted me out. I found a staircase going up to the train tracks on the bridge above me and ran to them. I ran up the stairs as the guards ran after me. At the top of the stairs, I saw the guards starting to climb the stairs. I started running on the train tracks, but eventually was yelled at by someone behind me. It was Jamal. "Stop running, Sylvie!" he yelled, and the guards surrounded me. "Just turn yourself in." I looked around me. I could probably take on all of the guards. I widened my stance and formed fists with my hand. "Don't," he started. I looked up. There was a helicopter above me. I looked at the building. Inside, there was a TV screen with text below it. On the screen was a live view of me. I knew that I wouldn't make it, so I dropped my hands. The guards came up behind me and arrested me. They started to walk me along the train tracks as I looked up at the sun in the sky. More and more flames started to fly out of the burning ship. I couldn't even say a word. Suddenly, an explosion busted open the side of the ship. People started to help the injured out of the collapsing ship. I stared in shock while my body urged me to go and help the people. I was about to fly over and help them, but soldiers started coming out of the ship and started to run to me. Once everyone was out of the ship, it started to cave in on itself. It folded to form a monstrous heap along the foot of the mountain. It still barely held its structure, though. All of the soldiers were lined up. General Rogers walked out of the ship and in front of the line of soldiers. "What have you done, Rye?" he asked. He looked at me, disappointed. Before I could say a word, Sylvie stepped forward. "Get out of our way, Rogers. We're not here for you," she said boldly. "You aren't? Well, you just blew up our ship!" he yelled at her. He started to step forward in front of her. "We're here for," she started, but I stepped in. "We're here for the Dark King," I said. Everyone except Sylvie and I gasped. He left us, though. He abandoned us," a soldier said. I recognized the soldier to be Marcus. "No, I was tricked to leave the ship by the Dark King," I yelled back. "That's not possible, because he left. He left because of you," Marcus yelled back. The soldiers raised their guns at me and Sylvie. They waited for General Rogers' command. "I'm sorry, Rye," he said, quietly, so that only we could hear. "I failed you." He walked through the soldiers, but before entering the ship, he raised his hand. The soldiers started to shoot at us. Sylvie threw something on the ground in front of us. A red, transparent shield popped up out of the ground. The shield slowly started to produce orange spots, which slowly got brighter when it sustained damage. She equipped her helmet, and I equipped mine. She was about to jump over the wall, but I grabbed her hand. "I only said that I wanted to get to the ship, but why are you doing this? I didn't want this." "Listen, you got what you wanted, right?" she said. I nodded. "Then, at least..." "Listen, I helped you, right?" she said. I slowly nodded, unsure. "Then at least help me to get what I want." "What do you want, Sylvie?" I asked her. She paused, but finally continued. "Well, the Dark King deserves to pay for the things that he did." "What did he do?" I asked. A bullet shot through the burning shield. "Listen, it doesn't matter. Will you please just help me?" she begged. I looked at the soldiers. Their relentless faces weren't going to show mercy. I looked up and closed my eyes. If I helped her, all of those soldiers would die, and this dimension could be at risk with no one destroying the replicated planets. I looked back at Sylvie. I finally decided. She had done enough for me, so it was now time for me to help her. I nodded at her. She nodded back. At that moment, the shield dropped. I unsheathed my sword, and she unsheathed hers. We looked at each other as the soldiers ran toward us and jumped into battle. I sat in the chair on the top floor of the building, looking at the other men circling me. "If you had only let us do this our way," Chris said, "we wouldn't be here." "You were trying to ditch me," I yelled back. "We were trying to find out who you even are," Chris yelled back. He placed his hand over his forehead and went to the window, disappointed. "All of these years," Xander said, "we've told you everything about us." "But you," Aaron jumped in, "you haven't mentioned a single thing about where you came from." "That's because I don't know. It's like I was brainwashed or something," I yelled back. "Or you're hiding something," Jamal said from behind me. I turned around as he walked in front of me. "Why would I hide something from you?" I yelled at them. "For once in my life, I found where I belong, and you still treat me like garbage?" I yelled. Chris walked up to me and shoved me to the ground. I was surprised by what he did as I hit the ground. I looked back up in terror as the other men joined him. They slowly walked closer and closer to me. I was backed up against the wall. In the corner of my eye, I saw a gun. I looked back at Chris, Xander, Aaron, and Jamal. They had no mercy in their eyes anymore. They wouldn't change. Chris threw his fist at me, but I rolled to the gun and picked it up. "She has a gun!" Aaron yelled. The men leaped back and spread out through the wide, luxurious room. I crawled on my hands and knees behind the big couches and tables. I saw Chris come from behind me. He jumped onto me and tried to grab the gun. I wrestled him from the gun, and eventually I kicked him in the stomach. I crouched down and moved to the window. He dived at me from behind, but went right over me. He lay, slumped against the window. I pulled out the gun and closed my eyes. I shot him directly in the neck. The bullet went through the window. He started bleeding rapidly, but he still stood up somehow. I shot him 2 more times in the chest, and eventually he fell to the window. He cracked the glass and fell through it. His bloody body fell further and further down the side of the building. Xander screamed and yelled at me. I turned around, but he punched me in the face. I stood up and shot him in the face twice. He fell to the ground. Aaron came from behind me and tackled me to the window. He choked me as I felt the breeze from the wind blow across my face. I swung my feet up and he went over me and out of the window. He barely held onto the window's ledge, but I stepped on his fingers and he fell as he screamed. Jamal came from behind me and pushed me out to the window. He walked away from the window, panting as I fell out. Luckily, I also grabbed onto the window ledge. He came back to the window. He looked down and began to lift his foot to finish me. I tried to reach for the gun, but I couldn't reach it. He slammed his foot down on my fingers and I screamed in pain and agony. He did it over and over. My grip slowly began to loosen. With all my remaining strength, I grabbed the gun from my other hand and shot it at Jamal. "I'm sorry," I said. The bullet entered his neck and went out to the top of his skull. His blood started to drip over me as he fell out the window. Down on the ground, many people were wondering what was going on. There was also the police. I climbed back into the room and went to lock the door. I heard banging on the door and I backed up. I was out of ammunition, so I dropped the gun. I was cornered. Suddenly, the roof began to fall upon me. Pieces of the roof began to get closer to me. I was going to die there. I lunged forward and stabbed another soldier. I flipped my sword around and sliced another. The ground was filled with dead bodies and guts as my sword was covered in blood of my own friends. But now they were my enemies. I jumped on 2 more soldiers and kicked them back. The soldier behind me was about to shoot me, but Sylvie jumped to the way and stabbed him from behind. We looked around. It was finally silent. The ground was covered with bodies bathed in blood. I saw General Rogers slowly come toward us in horror. Sylvie raised her sword and threw it at him. I threw my sword and it collided with hers. "What are you doing?" I yelled at her. I unequipped my helmet. "What are you doing?" she yelled back and also unequipped her helmet. "We have to finish him. You said you'd help me." "I did," I yelled in her face. "Look at the bodies, Sylvie. Isn't this enough for you?" "There's still one more," she said, with hate in her eyes as she looked at General Rogers. "No," I said as she started to run toward him. She grabbed her sword as she ran and jumped toward General Rogers. I boosted myself toward her and in the air, I threw my sword at her armor. It reflected off, but it redirected her away from General Rogers. We both landed in the mud. We both stood up and equipped our masks. I swung my sword at Sylvie, but she blocked it and swiped at my legs. I jumped over and poked my sword at her shoulder. I raised my sword, but she blocked it and parried my attack back. I flew back, and she ran toward General Rogers. I pulled out a gun from my side and shot her 4 times in the side. She looked back at me in anger and hatred. I stood up and kept on shooting her. She threw her sword at me, and it sliced my armor. I dropped the gun in pain as blood came out of me as she ran toward me. She grabbed my head and flipped me over. I flipped with her, and she slammed me to the ground on my back. I groaned in pain, but she picked me up and held my head as she punched me. My head flew back, and she continued punching me. She eventually kneed me in the chest and ran to General Rogers. I tried to stand up to protect him, but the wind was knocked out of me, and I was too weak, so I had to stay down. She ran forward and stabbed General Rogers through the chest. He gasped for pain. I screamed in despair as a cold shudder ran through my body. She pulled her sword out of Rogers and looked at me. He fell to the ground, and I felt my heart sink. I had disappointed him, and had got him killed. I gathered the strength and anger to stand up and run at her. She looked up at the other piece of land above us and jumped to it. I jumped after her. Halfway up, our gravity switched, and I started to fall. My body and suits were in too terrible of a condition to save myself from crashing into the ground, so I did. I slid on the grass and eventually stopped. I stood up and looked around. My visor was seriously damaged, so I unequipped my helmet. I was bleeding all over my body. It sparked wildly as it ejected itself. I looked forward and saw Sylvie walking down the road. This road was stone and lined with buildings. I limped after her through the empty winding streets of the city. I left a trail of blood as I limped after her. I eventually ended up at a fountain. This was the same place where I had practically broken my back in a fight with Chris many years ago. This was Jamal's world. Speaking of Jamal, he suddenly flew back into the fountain. The fountain broke and started rushing out water. I ran to him, and he looked bruised and injured. I hadn't seen him in so long. He got out of the rubble, stood up, and stopped to look at me. You, I replied. Are you with her? He asked. I was, but now I'm not. She killed Rogers, I said. He looked at me in shock. And she also beat me up too, so, yeah. I can see that, he said. I smiled. It was nice for him not to be so mad at me anymore. Suddenly, Sylvie came from the sky and raised her leg to kick me. "Oh, come on," I said as she kicked me back. Since my suit was so weak, I could feel my rib bones being juggled around in my rib cage. I watched as Jamal and Sylvie fought. I could barely do anything because I was so weak. I had to be better, stronger, but I couldn't. I heard a door open behind me, and out stepped Jamal's version of Rye. My eyes widened as he ran toward me. "You? Oh, I thought that you'd never come back," he said as he flipped me over. "Get out of here. You need to run, now," I said to him in fear, but before he asked why, he looked up and saw Jamal. His eyes widened, and he started to walk toward him. "No, don't," I said as he walked forward. Sylvie kicked Jamal back to a tree and looked at Rye. I could only watch the events that were about to happen. She walked toward Rye and grabbed him and jumped up with him. He looked nervously down at Jamal and me. We were both screaming for him to come back. She dropped him high up, and he began to scream as he fell. Jamal jumped up and grabbed him. Sylvie scowled at him as she soared back to the ground. She landed near a tree in the city square and ripped it down. It formed a long wooden spike. It reminded me of the exact same wooden spike that had killed Oscar. I saw where this is going. Jamal set Rye down as he continued fighting Sylvie. Sylvie kicked him, and he fell back. She picked him up and threw him across the main square. She walked to Rye and picked him up. He looked at her in fear as she smiled. He grabbed him by the shoulders and held him to her side. He looked at me as tears rolled down his eyes. "I don't want to die," he begged. Sylvie got ready to leap forward. Don't we all? She launched herself toward the spike, but moved Rye away from her in the way of the spike. The spike impaled Rye down the tree. His blood splattered onto her face as she let go. The spike was slathered in blood and organs as Rye looked at Jamal and me. He tried to say something, but nothing came out. Jamal screamed in rage as he ran towards Sylvie and kicked her. He punched her continuously and didn't stop. He broke her helmet, and Sylvie started to spit out blood every time she was punched. I slowly started to crawl toward them. She finally swept Jamal's leg and landed a powerful punch on his chest. He gasped for air as she picked him up. He dragged him into the air and kicked him down. I could hear the shattering crack of his backbone breaking. He screamed in pain and anger and sadness and hatred. She landed and picked him up. He threw him to the spike, and he slid back on it as well, impaled. His suit slowly fell apart as he looked at his injury. He looked at me. "Rye," he said as he reached out toward me. His hand dropped, and he fell limp. Sylvie walked to me as I screamed in despair, screaming and crying, the blood mixing with my tears as I slammed my fist against the concrete. They were all gone. I watched as a life left Jamal's eyes, just like Oscar's had 4 years ago in Colorado. She shoved her fingers into the back of my suit near my neck and lifted me into the air. The suit began to feel heavier and heavier as I was carried to the fountain. She threw me down into the large pieces of stone. I could barely see, but from what I saw, it looked like she was forming a large web across the sky above. She grabbed me and threw me up into the web. My body turned around and saw Sylvie with some bloody cuts around her face. She smiled at me as the web closed. The web closed to an orange sky. I started to flip around uncontrollably and saw the city of Los Angeles before me. I looked down even more and realized that I was heading straight toward a yellow building. At the base of the building were many red and blue flashing lights. I threw my hands up to protect my face and crashed through the roof of the building. I flew down and landed on a bunch of rocks. I was so tired after everything that had already happened. I felt like there was no way I could stop Sylvie now. It was too late. I rolled over onto my back and looked up at the hole that I had come through. I felt like I might as well die there. I had lost. I failed General Rogers and Jamal. Jamal just met his one and only friend, and the moment he did, he was taken away from him. I slowly turned over onto my side and felt all the broken bones in my body slump to that side. I began to close my eyes, but saw someone walking towards me. I kept my eyes open just a little bit longer as they started to walk closer, trying to dodge all of the falling rubble. I could only see the silhouette of the person. I didn't even know if I could try and save them. I rubbed my eyes and cleared my vision. In front of me, I saw Sylvie. She was nervous and breathing heavily. She wasn't the same person. I looked up and saw the entire roof collapse over us. This episode was recorded by Tristan Kumar. If you enjoyed this, make sure to check out Act 6. And that will be the last act in the Dying Planet trilogy. Yeah, quite a tragic last part, you know. Anyway, if you enjoyed this, then make sure to check out the next act in Dying Planet's The Season of Chaos. Thank you so much for listening.